So you're essentially asking farmers to sacrifice cow numbers so that it'll buy society time. That is the argument that needs to be made. But no one is making that argument to farmers.
Yes.
Everyone is simply telling farmers that their methane is causing global warming.
Which
their
it is.
Cows are killing the planet. Where the reality is that the reason the Paris Climate Change Agreement, the reason in policies around the world trying to cut biomethane is because it buys time for other industries. To me, that is grossly unfair.
This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 172 for the 7th of March 2024. In the world of what used to be called PR, these days they call themselves other things, information management or whatever. PR has PR'd itself. In the world of what we used to call PR, there's a standard practice of trying to present whatever the news is in as positive a light as possible for whoever the client is. Our client is delighted with the result of this case, that the jury has seen fit to exonerate him and declare him innocent on the parking fine, and he's more than confident that this minor matter of the conviction for murder will be overturned on appeal. That sort of stuff. So, when I saw the succinct headline in the Irish Times saying, "Rising number of Gardaí convicted shows forces culture changing," police authority chair says, I had to smile a little bit. Before Drew Harris took over as Garda Commissioner, there were typically about 30 or 40 Gardaí suspended per year. In the following years, the number went up to over 120 a year, although it has since dipped below 100. The number of convictions of Gardaí has shot up in parallel. And the policing authority thinks that that increase is a good thing. It's a sign that what they delicately call the culture of An Garda Síochána is improving. They might have said the quiet bit out loud there, but I think that they're probably right. But whatever PR intern, junior reputational governance associate, wrote that line, maybe should have thought it out a bit better. It is a good thing, but the fact that it's a good thing is not a good thing. In a moment we'll have the interview, but first I want to say thanks to all of the patrons on Patreon. I really appreciate everyone who donates. We don't get a huge amount of money out of it, not nearly as much as some other Irish podcasters I could mention, but it pays for things like web hosting, and Kevin and myself basically donate our time for free. It's also a big morale booster when we get a new patron. It lets us know that there are people out there listening and appreciating the podcast. We make a big effort to cover things that are undercovered in the Irish media. You're more than welcome to listen for free, but if you think that you could do the same as the other donors and throw in the price of a cup of coffee once or twice a month, there's details how to do that on the website and at the end of the show.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? Follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter and like Here's How on Facebook for updates on each show's contents.
On the line I have Andrew Wright. He's a fourth-generation farmer from County Tyrone. He's also a bit of a tech whiz, which isn't a combination that you might expect. But if that wasn't enough, he's lately become a bit of a social media star with 35,000 followers on TikTok and thousands more on YouTube. And one of his recent videos has turned out to be pretty popular. It's got well over 250,000 views as we record. That video is giving some of Andrew's views on farm-based emissions and climate change. Andrew, are you just another science denier, one of these people who says climate change doesn't exist, that it's all a conspiracy by the lizard people using Jewish space lasers or something?
No, I make the argument much more difficult for the other side by actually basing mine on science. Okay,
so you are committed. You're committed to a scientific approach.
Yes, it makes total sense to me that digging up carbon from under the ground would have an effect on the planet. That is logical. So my background is done a degree in agriculture. Dissertation was in greenhouse gas emissions from dairy cows. If you would like to say I totally bought into everything I was told at university. I had 2 climate scientists as my dissertation supervisors, and for 6 years after I left uni, I never questioned anything that they had told me.
Okay. One thing I want to do that, and I'm going to get into that, but I just want to start with this clip that I've taken out of your video.
The biggest lie in the world right now is that cows are killing the planet. At the core of that lie is how methane is calculated, and in the next few minutes I am going to take you through. This next bit is where climate scientists like to gaslight us farmers and say that methane is not the same as CO2.
There, you're explicitly saying that climate scientists are lying. You're not saying that you're not saying that you disagree with them. You're saying that they're lying, that they're intentionally saying something that they know to be untrue, and that they're gaslighting, that they're trying to convince other people of things that they themselves know to be untrue. That's the case, isn't it?
Pretty much. It is lying by omission. So
okay,
if you
no, hold on for a second. What you said is that they're lying. Can you cite a specific example of that?
The people who watch them videos, the thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of farmers, okay, they will never have heard that video, that process of methane breaking back down to carbon. Methane.
We'll get to that. We'll get to that. But I'm specifically saying, can you give a specific example of someone who's a climate scientist and a lie that they've told?
I can't give you a single example.
Okay. Have you made any complaints to like a university or to a professional body?
No.
No. Okay. But it's a strong accusation. Depending on the context, that would be certainly for an academic scientist would be enough to get them fired. In some contexts, it would be something that could attract criminal charges. You're tarring them all with the one brush.
Yes, that is part of delivering a message on social media that is going to reach a lot of people. It is using... I can absolutely understand you want to reach a lot of people, but how you do that, if in particular you are saying that other people are lying, and not just saying that they're untruthful, that they're lying, you have a particular duty to be truthful yourself, don't you? And not to lie by omission, as you put it. You would be correct, yeah.
Okay. And I want to look at those arguments because I want you to be able to fully explain what you're saying and for people to understand that. The purpose of this podcast is to bring light to the argument rather than heat, if that's not an unfortunate metaphor. And I just want to give people a tiny bit of the science on this so that people understand it. And basically, sunlight warms the earth. If we didn't have it, we'd freeze. And the sunlight is coming in constantly, and if that heat didn't radiate away, then eventually we would fry. But the heat does radiate away, more predominantly in the form of infrared light. And the thing about that is that while visible light, the light that we can see, the atmosphere is transparent to that. So that's why the atmosphere is invisible. We can see through it. But some gases, notably CO2, are not transparent to infrared light. Infrared light is blocked by CO2, so it blocks the energy from bouncing back out into space again. So basic physics would be that the more CO2 you have in the atmosphere, the more of the incoming energy will be trapped and not get out. So the planet warms up, and that can have drastic effects on rain patterns and on the strength of tropical storms, and could make the planet uninhabitable for humans. And from burning fossil fuels in the past 150 years or so, we've gone from 280 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere before the Industrial Revolution to 423 today as we record. I looked it up. But the one thing is that CO2 is not the only gas that traps heat, and methane does as well. Methane is basically the stuff coming out of your gas cooker. That's natural gas. And the good news is that there is vastly less methane in the atmosphere compared to CO2, about 1.7 parts per million compared to 423 parts per million of CO2. So it's far, far less. But the bad news is that methane is much more powerful at trapping heat than CO2, about 100 times more powerful than trapping heat. So given that there is far less of it, but it is far more powerful, that balances out at methane being responsible for about a third of the global warming that we are experiencing. And that's why methane is part of the calculation of emissions reductions, although it doesn't get in the headlines quite as much, but it is calculated in there, particularly for emissions reduction targets, and that's particularly relevant for agriculture. That's the science. Is there any of that you would disagree with?
Okay, right.
No, we can move on from that, but I just want to establish, is there anything there that you don't agree with?
Fundamentally, no.
Okay. And then I will allow you to expand on it, but I'm going to play another excerpt from your video just to allow listeners get the feel of what you are saying.
Let's take 10 carbon atoms from the air and follow their journey through one of my dairy cows. Grass uses photosynthesis to pull carbon out of the air and store it as energy in the form of carbohydrates and proteins. One of the 10 carbon atoms will leave as meat and milk, which is then consumed as food by us humans, and we emit the carbon as respiration. Another 2 of the carbon atoms are emitted as respiration by the cow, also not counted as an emission. The bacteria inside the cow's rumen takes the remaining 7 carbon atoms and converts them to methane, and them 7 methane atoms have 96 times the global warming potential of 7 carbon atoms. However, over the next 12 years, them 7 methane molecules that entered the atmosphere will break down into CO2 and water, completing our cycle. What this means is, if you have a stable number of animals, like this farm has for the last 12 years, as you emit the 7 methane molecules, 7 more that you emitted a decade earlier have just broken down back to carbon to be reabsorbed by the grass. So the net effect of the methane molecules emitted by my cows on global warming is zero. And yet, in all the carbon calculations, them methane molecules are accounting for over 70% of my farm's emissions.
Is that a fair summary of what you were saying there?
It is indeed.
No unfair editing. Okay,
no,
okay. Go ahead.
I will. So you've had quite a bit of a monologue. Mm-hmm. So if you would
go right
allow
ahead.
me. Okay, so I want to come back to your first point about the language I was using the word gaslighting. Okay. Mm-hmm. The important thing for people to understand is if you want a video to reach the audience that you're seeking to reach, mm-hmm. okay, you have to come across with strong language. Mm-hmm. I understand if people watched that video who maybe were climate scientists and they felt like that was an unfair characterization. That is absolutely valid. And if I met them in person, I would apologize to them for saying that.
Okay.
But it has a purpose. The purpose is it encourages engagement, mm-hmm. and it means that the core message, the point of the video, gets out there. So the point of the video was
are you essentially defining clickbait?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, well, that's very honest of you.
What it is. Yes, absolutely. So the point of this mm-hmm. is the core message of the video was not to say that climate scientists are gaslighting farmers. The core message was around the clip you just played, mm-hmm. around how methane was calculated. Mm-hmm. Okay?
Okay. So we can come back to that, and we'll do
That's okay. I am going to take you through the steps which I listed in that little bit you played of my clip. And at each step, if you have anything you'd like to challenge me on, we can stop.
I will skip straight to the challenge.
Okay, absolutely. Go ahead.
There is one word in there which you say, if the number of animals is stable.
Correct.
And to me,
that's very important.
That's about equivalent to saying that if you were locked in a cage with a hungry tiger, that wouldn't be a problem as long as the tiger wasn't hungry and you weren't locked in the cage with them. Because that's just excluding reality from the definition, because the number of animals is not stable. And in particular, the amount of meat consumed on the planet has quadrupled in recent decades. It is absolutely exploding.
Okay.
And
we'll stop at each point. We'll stop at each point.
Well, let me list them out, and then we can go back to each one. So number one, the amount of meat being consumed on the planet is exploding. Number two, the leading point of that curve was the West, us. And our meat consumption, maybe about 100, 150 years ago, over the last 100, 150 years, has shot up. Asia and Africa in particular are trailing in that, but most certainly following. And there is a load of methane in the atmosphere, which is created by the huge amount of animals that are produced for meat, notably beef, to supply people mostly in the West. And that load, as you are saying it, the load to supply the West, I think what you're suggesting is that it is not currently increasing.
Right. No.
Which is a little bit like saying, my house is on fire. The fire brigade come along and say, well, yeah, it's on fire, but it's about the same amount on fire as it was an hour ago. So that's stable. So sure, that's grand.
That is totally unfair characterization.
So go ahead and put your point.
I made it extremely clear in the video that it was in relation to my farm. I also made it extremely clear that for this to be true, it required a stable number of animals. Okay? And one of the common tactics used by climate scientists, by politicians, is to refuse to just focus on a simple scenario and instead divert the argument to an area where they know they can win. So by putting that video out and focusing it on an extremely narrow-banded argument of methane from my dairy farm, okay? That is the argument I made, and that is the argument that we should discuss. Now, you say about animal numbers increasing. I am from Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland is doing a national inventory to reach its net zero targets, and that inventory is conducted within Northern Ireland, okay? So what matters for me and my farm and the people who watch that video, people in the UK, is not global animal numbers, okay? It is national animal numbers, because that is where we are measured. That is the national inventory. The UK has a goal for itself to reach net zero, okay? There is no way the UK can dictate what happens in the rest of the world, just like farmers in the UK
actually they can. That's the
the
purpose of international treaties.
Well, the net zero target for the UK is for the UK.
That's correct. Each country has a target like
so
that, yes.
UK animal numbers have declined in the last 30 years. Northern Irish animal numbers, ruminants, have remained stable in the last 30 years. You can go onto the DARD website. It'll give you the animal population numbers. The cows on my farm have remained stable.
Across history and across geography, they are stable at an extraordinarily high level.
Okay, let's stop on that point.
Sure.
Okay? Let's pause there, because this is a very, very complicated argument. And if we try to get too complicated, no one's going to understand anything we say. Okay? Net zero is the goal to prevent further warming. Is that a fair statement? Okay?
Net zero is the goal to limit warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels.
To get to net zero means that there is no extra warming. Okay? Yes. So my cows, doesn't matter what the number of cows are in the planet, if the number of cows stopped growing today, then you could say that the methane emitted from cows is effectively net zero, because there is no extra methane. So my cows, the cows in Northern Ireland,
so
the cows in the UK,
I should have said one thing, Andrew, on my science bit, that unlike carbon dioxide, methane has a relatively short life in the atmosphere. So it is natural gas. So it oxidizes, and essentially what it'll do is it'll turn into carbon dioxide and water. And obviously there's an element of global warming with carbon dioxide, but it's only a very small fraction of what methane does. So methane will eventually work its way out of the atmosphere. It's got a half-life. And essentially, as I understand it, your argument is that you're saying that if you have a stable number of cows on your farm,
like we do in the UK,
the methane emitted today is balanced by the methane that was emitted 10, 12, 15 years ago, or whatever, degrading and in the atmosphere and essentially disappearing. So you have essentially the idea of a dripping tap going into a bath with a hole in it, and if the two drips are at the same speed, then the level of the bath stays the same. The problem with that argument is that the level in the bath is higher than humanity can sustain.
So there is two questions which society is asking farmers, okay? If you want us to reach net zero with methane at stable cow numbers, we've already done that, okay? If the argument is that the level of methane is so elevated that the cow numbers have to decrease so that methane will decrease, okay, for the benefit of all society, so that society can continue to emit carbon for longer and still not affect the climate. So you're essentially asking farmers to sacrifice cow numbers so that it'll buy society time. That is the argument that needs to be made. But no one is making that argument to farmers.
Yes.
Everyone is simply telling farmers that their methane is causing global warming. Their cows are killing the planet. Where the reality is that the reason the Paris Climate Change Agreement, the reason in policies around the world trying to cut biomethane is because it buys time for other industries. To me, that is grossly unfair.
Okay, so essentially what you're saying is that proportional to the size of the economy or to the people who benefit or whatever, agriculture is a gigantic contributor to what's called CO2E. That E means equivalent. So essentially what they're doing is that I'm sure you do, Andrew. I want to make sure that the listeners, we have intelligent listeners, but I want to make sure that they're up to speed on that. So that CO2E measurement is essentially adding methane into the mix at the level that it creates global warming. And the point is that farming was first to the table to start gorging itself. And you're saying that on essentially using the atmosphere as a landfill, as a dump, externalizing the environmental cost.
And you're talking about methane emissions from animals.
Hold on for a second. There is a mix of reductions which has to be realistic and which is, even as it is incredibly ambitious and very difficult to achieve in order to even come close to the limiting global warming. The amount of reductions that would need to be imposed on other sectors are just impossible if farming is exempted from them. And you are correct. And by the way, it's also true of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is weathered into rocks in a process that takes millions of years. So it's much more stable than methane. But you could potentially argue, well, the carbon dioxide will eventually be weathered out of the atmosphere. But the problem is, in the long run, we're all dead, and we'd be dead much faster if we don't do this. And I can understand what you're saying, that the drip of methane into the bath is equal to the drip of methane out of the bath, and that the water level is stable. But the problem is that water level, that temperature that is given by that amount of emissions in the atmosphere, is higher than can be sustained by humanity. Okay. And it was elevated by the enormous expansion in meat production that happened in the last 100, 150 years. So essentially you're saying, it seems to me, that you have some sort of right to that, or that you can continue to sustain that, and that others can't. And you focus very heavily on your individual farm. The problem is the atmosphere is not limited to your individual farm. And if you are asking, so the meat consumption around the world, the Western world that Ireland and Britain and the United States are part of, are absolutely exceptional compared to the rest of the world. The typical amount of meat consumption per year is about 150 kilos in the developed Western countries.
So
it is about 60. Hold on for a second. It's about 60 kilos average worldwide, and you get to poorer countries in Africa and Asia. It's down the poorest countries at about 8 instead of 150 kilos. Are you saying well, would you agree, first of all, and I'll hand over to you then, would you agree that if per capita meat consumption in Africa and Asia increased to Western norms, would you agree that would be absolutely unsustainable?
It would have an impact on global warming. The definition of unsustainable is very fudgy. I don't know whether it would or not.
Hold on for a second. You've got people who eat maybe 10% of the amount of meat. Billions of people who eat maybe 10% of the amount of meat.
This is getting too vague, and this is where arguments descend into nothing of use for anyone.
Okay, is the amount of meat consumed
You've
by...
You've had another
Go ahead.
Okay, and there is no point. The reason why I try to keep the argument simple is so that the issue can actually be addressed. So let's keep the argument simple. I'm not doing it to try to get away from what I said. The video was a simple argument. So let's stay focused on that.
Okay,
you have agreed with the facts that I presented in the video, which is the idea of a tap dripping in and dripping out. In my video, I said 10 carbon atoms in, 10 carbon atoms out. Okay?
Yeah.
Your point about the increase in livestock numbers adding methane to the atmosphere, which has warmed the planet, 100% valid. Okay? Totally logical. Correct, yes. However, net zero is about limiting warming. Okay? So then you will agree that if the animal numbers globally stayed exactly where they are, okay, in 12 years, methane from ruminant animals would effectively mean they were net zero.
No, it would not. Sorry, no, that's not correct.
So, right, okay, let's go back. Let's address this again. If the animals globally stabilized in their numbers, so they did not increase, they did not decrease. 12 years from now, the half-life of methane, the methane emitted from animal ruminants, okay, would mean that they have effectively reached net zero. As in, the methane emitted today is replacing the methane emitted 12 years ago. It is not contributing to a further increase in global warming.
Yes, but the current rate of increase is unsustainable.
Because animal numbers are increasing.
Yes.
So
and
the
because
point I'm caveating here, this is, listen again, I'll try once more.
Go ahead.
Stable animal numbers. Okay?
Globally.
They're globally.
Yes.
Right. We're doing a little exercise here in hypotheticals.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah. Stable globally would mean stable methane levels. That's correct.
And stable methane, that would essentially mean that methane from animals have reached net zero. Because net zero is there is no increase in warming.
No, that's not correct.
Okay, explain that to me.
Your science is flawed there. Because we have, just by this explosion in meat consumption in the West,
define net zero. Define net zero. Define net zero.
No, I'm not terribly concerned with net zero. I'm concerned with...
but that's literally the question that I'm asking you to compare stable animal numbers. Net zero by 2050 is to limit global warming by 1.5%.
Yeah.
Okay? The point of net zero is that the amount of carbon we put up matches the amount of carbon we take down, and therefore humanity's effect on the climate has been limited to 1.5 degrees of warming.
No, that isn't correct, because the heat is to a significant degree cumulative. So there's two problems with what you're saying. There's a political, social problem. There's two problems with what you're saying. One is a scientific one. It's just maths that you're not correct. And the second one is a political, social problem. And I think the scientific one is actually less interesting. But I'm more interested in the political, social one. But the scientific problem is that is a level of methane that is far higher than the pre-industrial level. And that will continue to trap more heat than the pre-industrial level of methane did, because it's more methane. Because the Western world, and which is only about 10% of the population, vastly increased their consumption of meat, and that created, you're correct, a step change. So it was a step change in the level of methane in the atmosphere. That's the scientific position. The political social one, which is much more interesting, I think, and relevant, because we can change it. We can't change the science. We can't change the society and politics. The political social point is that in the event that societies in Africa and Asia follow the pattern that we set, then we are absolutely screwed. Methane is incredibly powerful.
So let me
finish this.
How does destroying farming in our own countries have a positive effect on limiting meat consumption in other countries?
Because it is not politically possible to tell other countries, do as we say, not as we do.
So instead you want to cut the farming industry in our own country?
No.
Where do you get the reduction in methane?
First of all, there are other changes that can reduce the methane emissions. I'm not an expert in that, but I do know that there are others. But there's no question. No, there's no question. Hold on for a second. There are multiple reasons to promote a change in farming and related diet habits in the West. There are multiple reasons to do that. One of them is to step down that step change that happened with methane. And hold on for a second. If that methane level stays stepped up, that stays accumulating more heat that comes into the atmosphere that cannot then escape because of how powerful a greenhouse gas methane is. So that is certainly the case. But socially, politically, which we can change, and the science we cannot, is that it will not be politically or reasonably possible to persuade people in Asia and Africa to take a different path if we're saying, by the way, the farming lobbies or whatever other lobbies in our countries, they're getting an exemption, but you're not allowed to do the same thing as we're continuing to do because we've been doing it for a long time.
Your arguments are very complicated.
Maybe the case.
So let's try to keep
we
it
have
simple
intelligent listeners.
Because the video I put out, which we are here to talk about, the whole point of it was about delivering a simple message. Yeah. And this is why people don't understand the climate science and climate scientists, because they go down rabbit holes and it just ends up confusing everything. It is extremely complicated, right? So let's say on my farm, which is what I mentioned in the video, okay, on stable cow numbers, okay, I am currently getting penalised for 70% of my emissions coming from methane.
What's penalised?
So in the carbon calculations, it is saying that it's an emission, okay? So it's a one-way flow.
Yeah.
It's as if I was literally digging methane up from under the ground as natural gas.
No, it's not. It's calculated as an emission, which it is,
Yes, okay.
Yes. The fact that emission degrades over time, as does carbon dioxide, although much slower.
Okay, so if you would mind, you're interrupting me at everything I say.
Go ahead.
And I sit quietly and listen
Go ahead.
Okay? There is no difference in how the methane coming from my cows is calculated to as if I dug it up from the ground as natural gas and released it into the air. It is calculated in exactly the same way. Okay? So my argument in the video was that is a very unfair way to characterise my methane emissions. 2 years ago, in the latest IPCC report, they themselves say that the way they calculate methane from dairy cows and ruminants, biomethane, grossly overestimates methane emissions. They say 3 to 4 times. Okay? That is a fact. It's in their report. So the point from my video was, since I have had stable cow numbers for the last 12 years, okay, the net effect on climate, so how much extra warming there is from my 70% emissions coming from methane is zero. Yes, extra. Okay? Is zero. Would you agree with that statement in that specific context?
I think it's true but irrelevant.
So talk me through how it's irrelevant when, as a dairy farmer,
because
my
the
emissions are being calculated at the national inventory level, okay, with no account for that fact that my methane emissions today are replacing my methane emissions 12 years ago.
Okay, you want me to account for that?
Absolutely.
Okay, because the atmosphere doesn't stop at the end of your field. Because if you want to view that, even as you said, you're a 4th generation farmer, if you want to view that even as stable over several generations, you have essentially used for that amount of time the atmosphere as a dump for that methane, and that has created a step increase in the level of methane, which creates warming.
Pause.
You asked me
and take each part.
Okay, so number one, you can't expect to be treated differently because you've been doing it a long time. Number two, in fact, you can't expect to be treated preferentially because you've been doing it for a long time. There would be a good argument for somebody to say, oh, well, we've only been industrialized or had large-scale meat consumption for a short time. We should be at least allowed to go through that phase before tailing down again. But the thing, and I am not an expert, and I don't think, I think we've both done a lot of reading on it, but I don't think you have a particular expertise on it. But I have spoken to someone who has, and I've been reading specifically on this. And in fact, the fact that methane degrades in the atmosphere most certainly is taken into account in those calculations.
It's why the number used is 27 and not 96, okay?
Yes.
That is how it's taken into account.
Yes.
But that is taken into account based on the assumption that it comes from natural gas, from fossil fuels. That accounting of 96 down to 27 is used for fossil fuel methane. Mm-hmm. The IPCC report that came out 2 years ago itself...
methane, not burnt...
leaked methane. Okay,
yes, leaked.
So that is why there is that difference.
Yes.
Okay, that is not applicable to biomethane because of its short-lived where it came from.
It is
carbon
not that
that makes
short-lived.
Sorry,
it's not that short-lived. On
12 years.
On the time scale that emissions reductions have to be achieved, it's not that short.
Okay, well then I have a question for you. Okay?
Sure. My podcast.
Your argument is totally valid.
Yeah.
Okay, that if agriculture in the UK and Ireland was to cut their cow numbers in half, you would have less atmospheric methane, and it would reduce global warming.
Yes.
Okay, that is perfectly factual. Okay, and you talk about an elevated level from the farmers in the past, and bear in mind that they're over 30 years ago since cow numbers stabilised in the UK and they've slightly declined. Okay, what other industry or sector is being asked to take action based on the emissions they have produced in the past? Every other sector is being asked to stop net emissions by 2050. No other sector is being asked to account for historical emissions. It would be similar to demanding that people pay for carbon capture technology for the carbon they emitted 20 years ago on a flight to Barbados.
I'm not sure that it would. But point is...
Explain that. Explain what other industry is being asked to account for carbon they emitted in 20 years previous.
No, because you are sustaining methane at a higher level than is tolerable for humanity in the atmosphere. And we're doing that with only about 10% of the world having this very high level of meat consumption.
So
let's
stop at each point, because you say statements and then you just continue.
So go ahead.
Monologue,
Go for each one.
Okay?
Go ahead.
So you're talking about an elevated level of methane.
Yes.
Okay. That is the same as saying the airline industry polluted the planet in the 1960s.
Yep.
What other industry is being asked to take action based on historical emissions?
Okay, I hear what you're saying, and as I understand,
can you name another industry?
You're rhetorically making the point that farming is being treated differently. You don't, be it on Radio Ulster or BBC or RTE, you don't have to have the radio turned on for long at all before you get a farming spokesperson who will be saying very forcefully that farming should be treated differently to every other industry and should not be counted the same as any other industry. So I'm not sure that that's a valid argument that the farming industry
why
would
is
like
that not a valid argument?
Well, to begin with, agricultural subsidies, which were
what
actually generated
this. That's
which,
no problem. What do agricultural subsidies do? What do they actually do?
Well, I'm not going to get into that. No, the bottom point is I actually don't. I don't. The bottom line
what other
the bottom line is
asked?
that the agricultural leaders, farm leaders, have for a very long time insisted that farming should not be treated like any other industry. So,
I am not responsible for what they have said.
True.
Let's get to this point.
However, you do benefit from that, and farming does benefit from that, and I think that the social contract is there.
Remember at the start of this interview, you asked me some questions, and I gave you very direct, clear, honest answers.
Very good, yeah.
Okay, and I have just asked you, can you name any other sector which is having to make amends for elevated emissions in the past?
Yeah, I don't agree with that characterization, but I would freely admit that agriculture has to be treated differently.
Because why were we being treated differently?
Because of two things. Number one, it is not credible or sustainable, or it's just not going to happen politically, that we could have a different treatment for and more advantageous treatment for farmers in the West than the rest of the world. And the rest of the world is going headlong following farming.
We are not asking to be treated differently. We are being treated differently. We are asking to be treated the same. So you have, and this might take me a few minutes, so please bear with me.
Go right ahead.
You have made a very valid argument that methane is higher than it was 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And that has a big effect on how much the planet has warmed. Okay? If politicians can cut that methane, they can effectively roll back on climate change and cool the planet. That is the unique thing about methane,
reduce the amount of warming,
because it is short-lived. Yes, yeah. Okay? So farming and agriculture in the UK and Ireland is being asked to reduce, to make amends for our historical emissions.
No, this is not a moral issue. This is a survival issue.
Okay. My point is that we are being asked to reduce numbers because methane, because it has a short half-life, that our warming will then go down. We're the only sector that can reduce global warming. The carbon dioxide emitted, nitrous oxide emitted, the half-life is so long that it's a one-way line. It only increases. No other sector is being asked to account for emissions that they produced 20 or 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. So your argument around an elevated level of methane that has to be cut means that agriculture is being treated differently. Mm-hmm. So I am not asking that agriculture is treated differently. I am asking that we are treated the same. And when you look at the carbon calculations, this is the core point of my video, that we are being treated differently. Okay, that the calculations used for agriculture are not real. Okay, it's not a real emission.
I will let that stand as a point, but agriculture is also being treated differently in that it is being asked, at least in the south, in terms of the climate action plan, to generate a 25% reduction, whereby other sectors like transport, I think, is 50%, and other sectors like electricity generation is up to 85% reductions. The methane emissions, as you say, are a substantial part of the agricultural measurements.
70% for my farm.
That's fine. There is a lot more as well. It's 70% of a gigantic number. 30% of the gigantic number is still pretty gigantic. And
off that 30%, my business will sequester between 10 and 15% of that. So you're left with about 20 to 15%, 15 to 20% of my calculated emissions that are actually increasing global warming.
I'm not sure that calculation works.
That is...
But hold on for a second.
Sorry.
The CO2 impact of different foodstuffs, there's gigantic variation there. And in particular, the impact of meat, and in particular beef, is vastly higher. So per calorie of beef, you have about 30 times more CO2 emissions than for the most CO2 efficient foods, calorie for calorie. The bottom line, though, is that those targets need to be achieved. Okay, and if you are saying that essentially we should go easy, or make calculations in a way that is, as you would see it, more advantageous to farming, or less disadvantageous. But
fair.
Hold on for a second. There is no way to achieve anything close to the Paris targets without doing that. And for example, you have 85% reduction in emissions targets for electricity. And they're being, that's actually one of the most advanced sectors. After a while, you can't go any lower. Potentially, I don't think it's possible, but the absolute, even the maximum potential for electricity would be another 15%. And that's just not big enough to allow us to say that Yara should go on to farms or whatever. And the point is that people, for example, like Michael O'Leary and Ryanair, will say, sure, we're only 1%. But the problem is that everybody's only 1% of emissions. And there must be a realistic way that can be achieved. And if not that, then what?
Okay, so everything you said is true, 100% correct, okay? And this is why I used the word gaslighting in my video at the start, okay? Because you have just admitted what people don't ever want to admit to farmers. That is, we are the ones who are going to be cut. Our animal numbers are going to be decimated. In Northern Ireland, it's an 86% reduction by 2050, okay? Because the only way...
86% reduction
86% reduction in animal numbers.
Of animal numbers?
Yes, that's the Independent Panel on Climate Change. That's what their analysis of the current policies result in an 86% reduction in animal numbers, okay? Agriculture and farmers are being sacrificed so that the rest of society can reach net zero by 2050. So like you said, you can only go so low in the energy grid. You can only go so low in aviation. There's always going to be a need for carbon.
Yeah.
Okay?
But not quite as much as there's going to be a need for food.
Correct. And I don't understand the illogical stance that the government is taking around food security.
So you're referring to the British, referring to the British government. You're suggesting that they're going to achieve those targets by basically not having enough food for people.
They will import it and then therefore reach net zero but import more food. That is already the direction of travel.
Or you could grow different things.
No, we could not grow different things. Most livestock is farmed on land which is not suitable for arable crops. Where I farm in Oma would be considered good agricultural land. No one in this area grows crops because it does not work. Okay? So the only crop we can grow... The very, very few crops. It's maybe like 1 or 2%. Okay?
Okay.
And the reason is that what we grow here is grass. That's all we can grow. Because we get such high rainfall totals.
Yeah.
We get such high rainfall totals.
Yeah.
That is the most profitable crop to make. That's why everyone in my area is dairy farmers.
You know, 150 years ago, the population, or a bit more, maybe 160, 170 million years ago, the population of this island was higher than it is now. And there were no food imports, and there were very substantial food exports, and obviously pre-famine. And, you know, it doesn't take a genius to work out that one of the causes of the famine was the removal of crop growing and replacement with a much higher profit but lower, less producing meat. It strikes me that if in the past we could grow far more food and feed far more people, then that seems implausible.
It is not for debate that vast amounts, like we're talking 30 or 40% of all land based in the UK, is not fit for crop production. It could be much higher than that, and that is not my figure. You can go and Google it. Whoever's listening can go and Google it. There is a reason why farmers farm what they farm.
Okay.
If I could farm arable, I would farm arable.
Okay, I'm not. I don't want to target your particular business decisions. That's not the interest on this. But my question was: this is a proposal to create the solution to come up with an amount of carbon reduction, sector by sector, industry by industry. If not this, then what?
So fundamentally, I am not asking that agriculture's carbon is just ignored. Okay, what I am asking is that it is accounted for fairly. It is not accounted for fairly.
Okay, so are you object to the sums or to the outcome?
Yes,
if it was accounted for fairly and at the end of the day the same reductions were required, you'd be happy.
It is not accounted for fairly because, as I've described to you, UK stable animal numbers, 70% of my emissions from methane, it has no net effect on global warming, but everyone just ignores that fact because it benefits them to do so.
Okay, I will not rebut again that, but to move on very slightly, you say, and I believe you, that you are a believer in science and the real world, and you're not going to be saying Australia is fake and that there's an ice wall around the flat Earth anytime soon.
To be clear, like, I am a massive science nerd.
Like, okay,
that's my
point.
That's my point. I have a technology business.
Yeah, but the point is, and you mentioned clickbait before. The point is, if you look at the actually many thousands of comments on your video, they are a carnival of conspiracy theories and climate change denial.
That is completely an unfair characterization.
You're going to force me to.
You can pick out 20 or 30 comments out of it.
Okay, then I'm looking here. Carbon
you're picking out
contributing to
comments.
Global warming is the biggest con in the century.
People are always going to say that.
Yes.
This is the reality of the world we live in.
No, it's not. That is fantasy.
Yes,
it is a carbon emission contributing to global warming is the biggest con of the century.
Absolutely.
You say that carbon emissions do not contribute to global warming.
No. That people are always going to say that. I don't agree with that at all.
Oh, okay.
But I am not responsible for what someone comments.
Andrew, you are clearly, an intelligent and well-educated person, and you're clearly fit to be.
So I don't understand. Explain to me your argument that someone's comment on the internet is somehow related to me.
No. I'm saying that taken as a whole.
Was there anything I said that was not factual in my video?
Yes.
What?
You said that climate scientists are lying.
Okay, fair. I'll accept that. That's 100%. Was there anything about the science and the numbers which I said which was not correct in relation to climate change?
You mentioned lying by omission, and you said that
animal
the numbers are stable,
the point of the video,
and if you only count on your farm, but climate change doesn't only happen on your farm. But I know.
Pause for 1 second, because you're trying to insinuate.
Listeners have heard about that, and you have answered that.
Let's pause for 1 second. Okay. You're trying to insinuate that what I said is not factually true. Let's focus on the bit where I talk about the carbon calculations in relation to climate change.
Yes.
Everything I said in that video is factually true.
And true but misleading in the sense that you're limiting.
In what way? Did I say that it had to be stable animal numbers?
True but misleading in the sense that stable animal numbers are not an option that are open to us.
But did I make it clear that these calculations are relying on stable animal numbers?
Not to most of your commenters.
Explain to me how I didn't. If I have
you said stable, and
did I say methane is 96 times?
At the beginning, you revised your complaint against climate scientists to saying that they were lying by omission. And
I did not say that.
A single in a 3.5 minute video, a single word word stable, saying stable animal numbers, on which the entire thing relates. If you look at the comments, it's very clear that there was no substantial understanding that your argument is predicated on that and rests solely on that.
I completely disagree.
I'm looking at the comments here.
I've made it extremely clear that it was predicated on stable animal numbers. I literally said it in my video. I also made it clear that methane is 96 times the global warming potential of carbon. Okay?
Yes.
If you want to read through all of the comments where I replied to people, I have given them entirely factual answers.
I agree. You did. That's and I did look
at
many
of
them. There are thousands of comments.
At no point have I tried to fudge the science.
Andrew, I want to finish on this, because you're clearly somebody who's well fit for a leadership position in that community or wider or whatever. It is possible, and there is the joke of the Southern American politician standing up in front of his hillbilly constituents and yelling into the microphone how his opponent is a heterosexual and his sister is a thespian. And the fact that the words used were accurate doesn't entirely mitigate the fact that they communicated a different message to the audience. And the reality is, and anybody can look at this, and I'll put up a link on this on the page for the podcast, anybody can look through those comments, and it is very clear that the overwhelming weight of those comments that are supporting you, there's some people against you obviously, but the people who are supporting you are overwhelmingly taking an anti-scientific view, which I completely accept that you have not given and you have not promoted, but you haven't given any leadership on that.
Do you understand why people take that view? Because people don't make these arguments clear to them. Mm-hmm. So whenever I lay out facts, when I lay out science facts in a clear way, selectively if you want to call it that, I call it focused, okay? But when I lay them out to them, that's the first time they've heard that, okay? So it discredits it discredits the entire legitimate arguments that climate scientists have whenever I can point out something which they have choose to not tell farmers. And it happens around scope of emissions as well. You have scope 1, 2 and 3. No one understands it. Another grossly unfair thing when it comes to farming. And I want to be positive in this, okay?
Just to be clear for listeners, scope 1, 2, 3 is kind of basically whether you personally or as the businessman make that emission, or whether you buy something in as the emission, or whether you buy something from somebody who bought something who made the emission.
Exactly.
And I think your point is, and I actually think there's an element of validity to it, that farmers buy in essentially less emissions so that more of them are accounted for because they actually happen on the farm than might be typical with other industries. But so
what's our conclusion? Let's try to draw a conclusion from all this, because this is the problem with people talking about climate.
Here's the conclusion. Here's the problem. Allow me to answer. You asked because, and it is overwhelmingly shown by the great weight of supportive comments, and the comments are clearly, they're from your own community. They're overwhelmingly supportive, and they are overwhelmingly. No, allow me to. You wanted the conclusion.
There's well over 1 million views on the countless very people who reposted this around.
It's
well over 1 million.
Just on your account alone, I'm looking at it here. It's about 260,000, more than 250,000. But my point is that you're correct. There's a degree of sophistication to a message which doesn't always get through to people, and I'm not sure that is the fault of the people who are trying to communicate.
It absolutely is.
And it is. I think it is sometimes, but you have to be. You have to give people what they can intake. But if you were to reduce what you're saying down to one of two alternatives, whether it is we need to change or we don't need to change, the message that was received, regardless of what you said, the message that was received by your largely farming audience is we don't need to change. They're all against us.
So you have boiled it down to we need to change or we don't need to change, okay? What I'm asking for, and the point of that video, and what all of the comments in the video really want, is to be treated the same as every other sector, to have our calculations reflect the reality of how much carbon we are actually putting into the air that affects global warming potential. And the way agriculture is being treated, in the way methane is calculated, is grossly unfair. And it is done on purpose because if agriculture reduces emissions, it buys society time. I absolutely understand that. I understand the motives behind it. I understand why it's done. But if you were a farmer and this was your livelihood, which your family had done for over 100 years, you too would feel like you're targeted unfairly.
Andrew Wright, 4th generation farmer from Omagh in County Tyrone and growing social media star, thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you for having me.
Go to the website for sources and references from the show, and while you're there you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter at Here's How Podcast, and follow Andrew Wright at Farm Theory NI. And get in touch if you want to suggest a guest or a topic for a future show. Thanks again to all of the patrons on Patreon. It covers the cost of keeping the podcast going. And if you could throw in the price of a pint, or the price of a cup of coffee, or even the price of a curly whirly once or twice a month, please do go and sign up at patreon.com/here's how. That link is on the website. Also there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone, or by email. All that information is at www.here'show.ie. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. The co-producer is Kevin Wolf. Thank you for listening.